On the Gaza issue, BRICS countries have a point to make. The first pause in the conflict since it started on October the 7th is expected to begin at 7 a.m. Friday local time. 13 women and children are expected to be freed by Hamas that afternoon in exchange for Palestinians being held in Israeli jails. What are BRICS emerging countries and their new fellow members saying about this issue? A virtual summit on the Gaza conflict took place this week, featuring leaders and representatives from Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, as well as Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the Secretary General of the United Nations. A joint statement was released after the summit calling for an immediate, durable, and sustained humanitarian truce leading to a cessation of hostilities. What role can BRICS countries play here? How much of a difference will it make to the situation on the ground? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. I'm pleased to be joined from Shanghai, China by Professor Yin Zhiguang of the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University, from Oklahoma, the U.S. by Professor Joshua Landis, Director of the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma, and from Pretoria, capital of South Africa, by Gert, Grobler, a former senior diplomat of South Africa. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. First of all, I would like to ask our guests to comment on the very latest development, which is of course very welcome by all sides, that finally there is going to be a pause, or however you call it, in hostilities to allow the exchange of hostages for Palestinians being held in Israeli prisons. And earlier, CGTN posted this question to Gershon Baskin, a former Israeli negotiator who was part of the 2006 negotiations to release a soldier, Gilad Shalit, who was captured by Hamas. Let's listen in to what he has to say about the complexity of such a negotiation.
There's no precedent for this. We've never experienced anything like this. I think in the whole world there's never been a situation where there are 240 civilian hostages, mostly civilian hostages, held by an enemy in a conflict where the parties are completely determined to destroy each other. This is the reality on the ground. Israel is negotiating with Hamas through third-party negotiators with the intention of both sides to annihilate the other.
So, Professor Landis, I want to go to you directly to comment on the complexity, what has been going on behind the scene to secure such a volatile pause of hostility and what that means for the people on the ground.
Well, it's tremendously welcome for the people on the ground. It seems that what pushed Israel towards this negotiation and accepting it is that the families of the hostages in Israel have really raised their voice and begun to demand that something be done. They're worried that their hostages are going to get killed if this continues to go on. So that's the tension that Israel is fighting with. The United States has also been increasingly ratcheting up pressure on Israel to come to this kind of a ceasefire. And it's made other demands as well on Israel that they quickly find some solution for allowing Palestinians to go back to their homes, that they not attack the South, and somehow provide protection for Palestinians in the South. And of course, that's going to be the next move of Israel, is to come down to the south of Gaza and begin to try to destroy Hamas there, because Hamas is, in a sense, temporarily protected in the South, where the civilians have massed 2 million of them. So it's a very precarious situation.
Gert, in South Africa, I want to get your take very quickly on what do you think led to the truce, the negotiated truce, and what it means for people on the ground?
We all know that over the last couple of weeks, there's been tremendous pressure from the international community. There's been tremendous pressure from the families on both sides. So this can be seen as a positive first step, in the sense that it is a major act of a humanitarian act in the sense that the hostages are going to be released, food and water, etc., will be able to come in. But despite the fact that it can be seen and it must be welcomed, that I'm afraid the war is not over, and it's very disturbing to hear what the Israelis are saying, that they are now still going in to crush Hamas. They want to see that this doesn't happen again, and of course that they want to basically, as I say, crush Hamas.
So it means
I'm
that
afraid there's a long way ahead, and that worries us because we've got to stop the violence, we've got to stop the military, and we probably will come back to that in terms of what the international community should be doing.
All right. Well, let's take a look at what the international or major part of the international community have done. For instance, over 40% of the world's population belong in a member, I should say, of this BRICS group, which just expanded earlier this year to include 6 new members, including important countries in the Middle East. And just on Tuesday, November the 21st, as I said at the beginning, a virtual summit was held where leaders from these countries, as well as Secretary General of the United Nations, convened, and except the Prime Minister of India, the top leaders from the 5 major BRICS countries all made a speech, stated their position, and the summit also released a statement on their collective position. Let me go to our Chinese guest, Professor Yin Zhiguang, if you hear me. Why do BRICS countries believe that in this moment? All right, let me go to Professor Landis once again. Why do you think at this particular moment BRICS countries want to make a point? Do they have a role to play here? Because the truce was reportedly negotiated between the Palestinians and Israelis, and with the United States and Egyptians being involved. What role do BRICS want to play here?
Well, I think the BRICS have been looking for a role. We've seen this with a currency, trying to move away from the U.S. currency. But this gives, I think, the BRICS a common voice, because I would say the arrogance of European and American attitude towards people like the Palestinians, people in the South, non-European people, has something that has galled much of the global South. And this issue allows the global South to come together and demand that the hypocrisy, I think, that many feel the United States and Israel and the Europeans have held towards the human rights in places like Ukraine, where they object to bombing of hospitals, bombing of civilians, killing a terrible ratio between civilians and soldiers, and in Israel and Gaza, where that same objection has not been made as strongly. And I think that much of the world is registering a sense of hypocrisy there, and this allows them to come together and make that announcement.
Let me try once again to go to our Chinese guest, Professor Yin Zhiguang from the School of International Relations and Public Affairs at Fudan University. Professor Yin, how do you look at the role the BRICS countries are trying to play here, sending out a very strong message? And I actually haven't seen in recent times such a strong message, such a collective action being taken by the BRICS countries on such an international hot button issue.
Absolutely. I think this is, I would call it a silver lining in a very horrible disaster. On one hand, I agree with the previous guests that the current situation shows the incapacitated United Nations. Nevertheless, there is still a very strong consensus among the international organizations to push forward a humanitarian ceasefire. And it is quite encouraging to see BRICS country, formerly known as economic collaboration, now plays a much more political role on the
Are
international
they
affairs. To me, that's a revival of the South-South collaboration.
well, some people would say they're just trying to make their presence felt, because some people hold the view that, for instance, China or at least some other countries, they don't have direct impact or influence on the situation on the ground. What is your view, Professor Yin?
No, I think we have to jump out of that state-centric hegemonic view on big powers play a much bigger role in international society. No, I think now we have to encourage we have to imagine that the international organizations through state-to-state cooperation would play a much bigger role. It is a collective initiative rather than a single power's intention to intervene that makes the deal possible.
Well, Chinese President Xi, let's take a look at some of the key messages expressed by different leaders on during that summit. For instance, China's President Xi Jinping said China believes that the following is urgent and imperative. First, the parties to the conflict must end hostilities and achieve a ceasefire immediately, stop all violence and attacks against civilians, release civilians held captive, and act to prevent loss of more lives and spare people from more miseries. Secondly, humanitarian corridors must be kept secure and unimpeded, and more humanitarian assistance should be provided to the population in Gaza. Third, the international community must act with practical measures to prevent the conflict from spilling over and endangering stability in the Middle East as a whole. Mr. Grobler in South Africa, what kind of difference does China's message make to that by other countries who, let's say, the United States or European countries? Is there a big difference you see there?
As one can see from the statements made at BRICS and elsewhere, there is very close consultation, very close coordination between South Africa and the other BRICS members. And the point that was made early on, one of the key motivations of BRICS is to create a new multilateral system in which the developing world is treated as equals, and also as regards the United Nations. I mean, there is a very strong feeling within BRICS, and it came out from this meeting, that, and this is, as I say, a major goal of BRICS, is to reform the international multilateral system and to get the United Nations to act on, for instance, on Gaza. And I think President Xi also mentioned it was vitally important now for the United Nations to get their act together and implement the resolutions that have been adopted by the UN. In fact, there's been 2 now on Palestine and Gaza, Palestine and Israel. But we want to see action. We want to see movement. And I think it's in that context that BRICS can increasingly play a role.
Professor Landis, do you think, of course, to have a new, truly multilateral framework in place is good for the long term, but do you think for the immediate challenges that people are facing in the Middle East, this mechanism can be translated into tangible results in the very short term?
You know, I think looking at it from the Americans' perspective, China and the global South do not have a very, as you pointed out, do not have a very big influence on Israel. Israel gets its arms from the United States. It's powerful. It can do what it wants, and particularly if America is willing to veto in the UN. On the other hand, the United States is constantly looking over its shoulder at China today. One of the major efforts on the part of the United States was the Abraham Accords to bring Saudi Arabia and Israel closer together, which was why this Gaza thing broke out when it did. And that worries the United States. Now that that has crumbled, in many ways, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries, are turning to China. And they're going to China. Now, America isn't very worried about that at this time, but it's going to get momentum. And increasingly, much of the world is looking to China to balance the United States. And that's bad for the U.S. It's going to make it more difficult for the U.S. to keep the Gulf countries in its camp. And they're going to look to play both sides. And the anger that many feel, yes.
Yeah, do you think, if I can extrapolate from what you just said, Professor Landis, do you think that this anxiety or the sense of insecurity from the United States probably, help push for the establishment of this truce between the two sides, especially seeing that the BRICS countries are making such collective
I think you're absolutely right. Yes, you're right. It is. I think the pressure is growing on the United States, and young people in the United States are upset with the Biden administration because they see this. They don't like it at all, and they disapprove. Older people are supporting Israel, but younger people see this as too violent, too much bombing, and they don't understand it.
Okay. Professor Yin, what is your take on this? What exactly is the immediate impact, let's say, of BRICS countries coming together, issuing a joint statement, which I would say is quite balanced because it calls for instance, acts of violence against Palestinian and Israeli civilians were condemned, including war crimes, indiscriminate attacks and targeting of civilian infrastructure. The chair joined calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all civilians who are being held illegally captive. They expressed their deep concern at the dire humanitarian situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. They also reiterate the need for full respect of international humanitarian law without naming by which side. So what do you think is the concrete impact on the ground of this meeting? Did that have any influence on the agreement, the truce that has been reached by the Israelis and the Palestinians?
I mean, I absolutely agree. I think it is a brilliant statement coming from, more importantly, the Global South side. I want to emphasize the Global South perspective precisely because I agree with the Professor Landis' argument that the Americans had very strong influence on the Israeli side, and for a long time, America has advocated this particular type of influence through two channels. One is state-to-state relations, but on the other hand, it tried to form international alliances through international organizations. Now, for a long time, the Global South has yet to see a functionable international organizations that advocate the Global South perspective. And the BRICS statement made quite strongly and quite in a balanced way provides not only the actual sort of support, a demonstration of actual support from the Global South side, but also provides a moral high ground for the entire argument on the Israeli and Palestinian issue. So in this sense, I think this is absolutely a very timely and very important change in the global sort of global system.
Are we going to see, however, Professor Yin, a split or race to the higher ground, to the upper hand in terms of its impact on international, on geopolitics? On the one hand, we have the Western Bloc, the Europeans being led by the United States. On the other hand, the global. So are we going to see polarized action that, they're trying different approaches and competing against each other possibly? Although it might bring concrete benefits, good benefits for the people on the ground.
No, I don't think there will be a split, or more specifically, I don't think there will be a bipolar structure. Bipolarism, the sheer meaning of bipolarism suggests that there needs to be two polar. And China has never.
Because right now we're talking about the global north. Right now we're talking about the global north and the global south. To me, that's already kind of.
There is no polar.
There's no polar. The two
there is
blocks.
No polar. There is no single center in the global south. the global south is a collective. Global south is a group of countries.
Okay.
BRICS, it's the name of itself. BRICS is a demonstration of a collective initiative. Sure, there is a very strong nations within the global south, China, but we can't really argue that China is a polar. Largely because you do not see that China wants to advocate its own national interest through the global south platform.
Well, it's everything done under consensus, as far as I understand. You mentioned this big country in the BRICS. I would say there are other big countries in the BRICS as well. For instance, the country that initiated the summit, South Africa. Mr. Grobler, South Africa initiated this meeting, and South Africa actually made some of the strongest statements during the meeting. Could you help us understand why South Africans or South Africa government feels it's particularly pertinent for them to make these statements? Sometimes, some of them could be considered very, very sharp for the Israelis.
Now, let me just say on the issue of the global scene, we have in the world, we are moving away from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And in this context, BRICS is a very, very important, is going to play a very important role, as I said early on, to address the multilateral concerns that the developing world has. But let me come to South Africa. South Africa has a very long-standing relationship with the Palestinian people and have identified very strongly with their cause. Many years ago, it started, Yasser Arafat was here on a number of occasions. He and President Mandela met. And there is a huge anger and a frustration in South Africa about the lack of commitment on the part of the international community, in particular the UN, not to move forward with concrete steps towards a negotiated settlement. And South Africa's role.
What's the cause of that,
BRICS
though, Mr. Grobler? Sorry for interrupting. What do you think has binded the feet of the UN not being able to move forward in reaching a negotiated settlement of this issue?
Well, if one, and I think this is something that we're going to see from BRICS in the time to come, is a reform of the United Nations, and in particular the reform of the United Nations Security Council, because they have voted a number of times now, and every time each of the five so-called P5 members, they veto this particular resolution to protect their own national interests. And somewhere along the line, and I know that in the BRICS meeting we had here in South Africa, there was a long discussion about UN reform. And what we would want to see is, and President Xi has also mentioned that, as I said earlier on, that the UN must now implement the resolutions that have been adopted not only now. There have been resolutions adopted against Israel for years. In fact, I read that in the period 2015 to 2021, more UN resolutions were adopted against Israel than whole of the rest of the world together. And yet nothing happens. The UN is not in a position to implement, to force Israel to adopt this. And I think this is what South Africa and BRICS increasingly will be focusing on. BRICS is there to take care of the developing world.
We're looking at the picture of the latest, however, UN Security Council resolution, which was adopted, much to the relief of the world, under China's presidency, where the resolution is called Resolution 2712, and it says that all parties must act to deliver on these resolutions through concrete measures on the ground. And it's mostly focusing on humanitarian measures, humanitarian truce. Professor Yin, let me go to you. under the context, under the circumstances, what Gert just mentioned, years of inaction because of the maybe structure obstacles in the United Nations. Why was China able to push to preside over the adoption of Resolution 2712?
Well, I think there are, off the top of my head, there are at least two reasons. One, the global south is no longer the global south decades ago. And the global south, by grouping together, provides a much stronger bargaining power against the rest, the global north, if you want to put it that way. And under that circumstances, we can see that the consensus, the world has already seen there is a consensus forming in the global south, and it will be completely a lose of face for the global north not to follow that consensus. And that's one. On the other hand, China, with the development of China and the global south altogether, particularly the BRICS country, they play a much stronger role, and henceforth they were able to provide much more aid than before. And as we see that previously, most of the international aid are coming from the global north. Mm-hmm. So that partially explains why the inaction with regarding the Israeli issue. But now the global south has the power.
Has more power, let's say. The resolution was passed by a vote of 12 in favor to none against, which is crucial, with 3 abstentions, Russia, UK, United States. Nevertheless, it was adopted, and it calls for urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors through the Gaza Strip to facilitate the provision of essential goods and services. I want to go to Professor Landis. You were just talking about the United States looking over the shoulder to the global south. Can the United States and maybe the global south look towards each other and work together to help resolve this issue?
It's going to be very difficult for the United States and for China to resolve this issue because it really demands that Palestinians have self-determination. And today, even though the United States upholds the two-state solution as its official policy, it has never pushed Israel or punished Israel for settling in the West Bank. And the West Bank is a fairly large part of, it's occupied by the Israeli army, but over 700,000 Israeli settlers have moved into the West Bank against all international law.
So what is the meta discussion that must be had while we are having this humanitarian pause? Professor Landis, once again, I give you 30 seconds, please.
Right. Well, the discussions have to be, how do you realize a two-state solution, and how to work with Israel?
Is it still possible? Is the two-state solution still possible?
I don't think it is possible for Israel to withdraw 700,000 of its citizens. That's almost, one in every 14 Israelis.
So why is everybody talking about two-state solution then?
Because they don't know what else to do. Because if they go for a one-state solution, it means undoing a Jewish state, because there are 7 million Palestinians and 7 million Jews living in historic Palestine.
Sure. Okay.
And if you,
sorry, Gert, one last sentence. What must be done next in order to have that discussion about what to do? 5 seconds, if you can, Gert. Sorry.
The international community must step forward and start a committed process to finding a two-state negotiated solution.
Thank you very much. We have to leave it there. Many thanks to Professor Yin Zhiguang, Professor Joshua Landis, and Gert Grobler for joining us. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got the point.